Hello, my friends. I'm glad you're back. I am here in this video today, right now, talking to you about whether you should or should not be sharing excerpts of your memoir, either as you are drafting or once your memoir is finalized and you're leading up to launching it and trying to promote it, or even afterwards. So let's talk about this. Should you be sharing excerpts? I'm never going to say you have to do anything, but excerpt sharing can give you a couple benefits that you may not see elsewhere. So let's talk about a couple of the benefits to doing this. Number one, they get people excited for your book. If you are sharing a portion of your book that, is kind of the maybe climax or leading up to it or some really action scene or something, you will get people excited to read the rest, right? When you read a portion of something that's really good, you're like, okay, I want more. So it can generate excitement. It can get people interested in your book. You can get more people following you. If you post in particular places, they may come join you on your website if you say, I got more, where that came from. So it can really give you that boost in building your audience and getting people excited to click buy when your book is finally out. You don't necessarily need to post excerpts after your book is published, but you can, in a way to, again, get attention towards your published book and to have people say like, oh, that was really interesting. I'd love to read more. Oh, look, I can go buy it right now. Get that instant gratification on things. So you can think about that. It also will potentially generate some interest from agents and or publishers if you are looking towards more of a traditional publication as the end goal for your book. If you are, think very strategically about this so that you are putting your best excerpts forward. And you also want to strategically think about where you are posting these things. So we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But it can get some attention from those particular professionals in the book industry if that is indeed part of your goal, to get a traditional deal. It can also really bolster your author bio. Think about it. If you are posting short excerpts, kind of posed as short stories in some more well-known publications, that's going to be a great place for you to say, look, I'm published in XYZ and ABC and all of these other places. And again, agents may perk their ears up a little bit over that. And you just also look like you are more serious in the book game, right? Like you are out there getting your name put in places, and not just hanging out on Facebook, right? So people will, you get exposure to those other audiences. So people will be getting more exposure to you and getting to know you and hear more about your book. So you're reaching more people. You're broadening your reach that way. And people will come find you in places that you're hanging out in. So it's just a way to kind of get people back to you. But it looks amazing on your author bio to say, like, I've been published in these other places too. Yay. So there is some clear benefits to doing it, but you want to make sure that you are doing it the right way and that you are crafting an effective excerpt. So an excerpt isn't just like copy and paste from chapter 1 and throw into a blog post or something, right? Like that's not really what an excerpt should be. So let's talk about what an excerpt should be and what makes a good one. Typically, your first chapter, because hopefully you've crafted that in a way that gets your readers engaged and connected with your book well enough to want to keep reading it, right? Like it's a strong piece of writing. It's exciting for them, and you've kind of had that hook placed in there to get them reeled in, like what's going to happen in this book. That typically means chapter 1 is usually a great place to excerpt. It doesn't have to be chapter 1, but think about what piece in your book can kind of stand alone as a separate piece of writing that has tension and is interesting and can keep people engaged with it separately, where you don't necessarily need to feel like you have to fill in a bunch of gaps. Maybe you do. We'll talk about that in a second. But what standalone scene or piece can be taken out of your book that is like, whoa, like this part of the book is what people will remember. Maybe there's 5 big moments in your book and this is one of them, right? And they go and they tell their friends, oh my gosh, in this book, you won't even believe what just happened. So that might be your first chapter. It might not be, but chapter 1 is usually a good place to look at for a strong excerpt. So again, it can be pulled from anywhere really, but you want to keep the, mind your backstory, like how much backstory is necessary so that excerpt makes sense. In that sense, if you have a scene that does rely on some backstory, but that backstory comes, like let's say in chapter 2 and you're excerpting the scene from excerpting, how am I saying this, ladies? Excerpting, okay, whatever. You're taking the scene you're taking the scene from chapter 5, right? But the backstory exists in chapter 2. What you should feel free to do is edit your excerpt. You don't have to be like honor the exact text as it appears in your book. It can come from separate pieces, but it needs to come together in one cohesive standalone piece that doesn't leave gaps, that doesn't leave questions. So again, if this scene that you want to include from chapter 5 requires some backstory from chapter 2, put those 2 pieces together and do a little revising. There's really nothing that says you can't do this. Think of an excerpt as a way to showcase your book. You're going to give them something from your book, but it does not have to be exactly as it appears in the book. It doesn't actually even have to appear in the book, okay? This is another little fun thing. You can write a short story excerpt that is related to your book. It's not really an excerpt that way, but it's more of a short story or a little vignette of your life, right? It's related somehow to your book, but it's really not in your book. That's totally fine. It draws from the material that you have in your book, but for some reason, some logical reason, it's not in your book. That is acceptable as well. So there may be that moment that you're like, oh, this just somehow doesn't fit in my arc, or it doesn't feel like it fits on the timeline or something. Maybe it's something that happened after your book ends, or something that happened way before it that's interesting but still not totally belonging in the book for some reason. So it can be kind of a brand new little story for you. It doesn't have to be literally copy and pasted from your book, okay? So think about that. Now, that being said, it still needs to be a standalone, very engaging piece. It needs to feel like there is some reason, there's something in that story that's going to bring your readers to your book. That's really the key part about sharing an excerpt or this type of separate short story, separate vignette, separate piece of writing. You want it to feel connected enough that when they pick up your book, they're not going to be like, what? This isn't related. This is just like another piece of her life. Like it's got to have a strong tie in somewhere so that they don't feel ripped off, like tricked, like, okay, she gave me this really interesting story, but then her book is like totally something different, right? So think about how they're connected that way. Another way to craft and create this very effective excerpt that draws people to your book is by keeping it under about 3,500 words. You don't want it to be huge, but it has to be enough to showcase your writing skills and style, your voice, the way that your story might keep people engaged. 3,500 words is probably about a standard chapter size or so. So, it's not a small piece of writing, but it's not a huge piece of writing, in the sense like you're writing another book or even a short book, right? It's just 3,500 words is a nice, decent size Word document, 10 pages or so, right? So it's a good deeper dive without it being an entire book, right? So that word count is also really important with where you want to publish this, where you want to have your excerpt shared or published. On if it's a third-party site, they're most likely going to have some word count limits that you're going to need to take into consideration. They may have some other formatting things as well, so just pay attention for that. But the word count is important to think about because you don't want your story to feel like it goes on and on and on, and it's just like half of a book. But you don't want it to be like this tiny peak. You want to give them enough to get their appetites wet and for them to feel like, oh my gosh, I need more. So we talked about kind of how to do this in like what type of scene to select, but what if that scene feels like it doesn't end your book, right? Like it doesn't have to be the end. What if it's the beginning and there's so much more to say? Good question. You need to probably do some revising so that your excerpt feels like it comes to some logical conclusion, or it at least hints at some type of resolution to come. It shouldn't necessarily have a huge cliffhanger, but at the same time, you don't need to wrap up everything. There can be some leftover tension in the air. You don't have to necessarily tell us exactly what happens, because then you're sort of just previewing the entire book. You're sort of just summarizing your book for us, right? So think about how to wrap the ending up in your excerpt in a way that it is, neat and tidy. It wraps things up for your readers. They don't have like tons of questions left, but they are wondering like, well, what else is going to be happening in this girl's world? What else is going to be happening in this entire big story that I know she's not sharing the rest of it with me here? They're willing to go look for more based on what you've left them with. So that is how you kind of should think about the ending for your excerpt. And again, just like, some of the backstory stuff that you may need to take from other places, you could even write a fresh new ending to this little scene. It might not be in your book, but it might just be a little ending to the scene, if you will, to the excerpt. So once you have your excerpt written up, it feels like a standalone piece that's engaging. It's around that word count. Here are some ways that you can actually, some sources that you can share this excerpt on in order to promote your book. Clearly, if you're running a blog, you can post it on your own blog as an excerpt. Make sure you tell your readers that this is a little taste of what you can get in my book. You can do that in your email newsletter as well. You can post the actual excerpt in the newsletter. I think it's a bit more effective to say like maybe there's a paragraph or so in the beginning that you post in your newsletter and you have a little click here to read more button, because then it gets them to your website instead of just hanging out in their emails. Maybe there is a reason why you are setting it up to just, maybe they've signed up to get an excerpt sent to them, right? So they've already signed up on your website. There's no need to get them back there. But that a newsletter is another way to complement a blog post or an author website in some type of way. Obviously, you can share on your social media pages. I know there are some people who are concerned with whether you post all the content on social media like Facebook and they own it. They don't own that they don't own it like that, but you could consider doing something similar where you post the first paragraph and then the link to your blog, right? Maybe you don't have a blog and you are just like, hey, I'm just going to post it on my author page on Facebook. That's totally fine too. And then you can take that and share that to your personal page or share that in other groups and stuff like that if you want to share your entire excerpt that way. You can also, of course, if you don't have a blog but you have an author website, there could be like a separate page for excerpts, or again, kind of with the newsletter, like they could sign up to receive an excerpt. That's another way to grow your email list, but you can promote that on your author website regardless of whether you have a blog or not. And you can, think about other places, other publications that may be interested in promoting, publishing and promoting, short stories, short memoir stories. There are publications out there that do this. I would do some research to see what might be a good fit for your particular story topic. And, you know, depending on your audience, you know, where you might pursue an opportunity in that area. But there are probably dozens of opportunities out there for specific, you know, excerpt publication, you know, sources, I guess is what I'm trying to say here. It does depend on your topic of your book, and who you're trying to reach. So just keep that in mind as well. So excerpts, yes, they can be a great thing. You don't necessarily want to blast people with excerpt after excerpt after excerpt. It can feel like they, you know, if they read too many excerpts, they can feel like, well, they kind of got the gist of your story. What's the point of reading your book, right? So you don't want to exhaust them. You want to entice them. You want to get them excited for it. You don't want to give them too much so that they're not interested in spending, you know, a few bucks on your book and a few more hours reading your story. It should just sort of get them hungry for it and not totally satisfy their appetite. So they are good to do. You could even think about doing them in smaller bits, if you will, but usually those aren't as satisfying as kind of those little small essays or a little, you know, almost chapter excerpt. You can call it chapter 3 or whatever you want to call it, if it truly feels like a chapter. But make sure that you're not leaving too many loose ends untied, again, with that backstory and maybe where it starts and where it ends. So there you go. I want to know if you've had good luck posting excerpts and where you've posted them, and if people really enjoyed them, and if you saw that it helped grow your readership or your audience, or if you think that this might be a good way for you to get some attention and excitement for your book. So let me know, and I will be back with another video on this topic, on the topic of promoting your book and running your author platform.